Distinguished Minister, Your Excellencies, dear friend, let me begin by congratulating those who a few years ago had the vision and the daring to bring this conference together. It is a landmark event for us here in Iceland, and if those who started in the 1930s to put pipelines in dirty streets in Reykjavik in order to heat the first houses in the city with geothermal water could have been with us here today, I think they would have believed that they had entered the world of the elves and the fairies that the Icelandic nation told itself for centuries in order to keep warm in cold winter days. It has been a fascinating journey for a small nation in the North Atlantic, a nation which, as we all know, for centuries was among the poorest, if not the poorest, in Europe, classified by the UNDP up to the 1970s as a developing country. And today and yesterday, you have come together, distinguished scientists, engineers, technicians, and business leaders, to explore the potential for geothermal progress worldwide. And I am not going to attempt here towards the end of the conference, neither could I, surpass this technological expertise or the engineering insights or even the financial acumen. But because I see this as a beginning of a further journey, I thought I might close here today by asking ourselves these two questions. Although it sounds paradoxical at the end of the conference to ask why are we here? But perhaps it is even more important to ask ourselves the question, where should we go? And the reason why I put these questions towards the end of the conference, as we will each of us depart to our homes, our working places, and our countries, is because I believe fundamentally, and I am not the only one, that time is running out. And last summer, that message was carried to this country by this vessel. It is the Chinese icebreaker Snowdragon, sent from Shanghai to Iceland across the Northern Sea route, close to the North Pole, organized by the Chinese Polar Institute, but with 60 young Chinese scientists on board. It was the first time in human history that a Chinese vessel goes through the northern route to an Arctic state. And the purpose was not imperial ambitions by the Chinese leadership. The purpose was to examine closely and thoroughly what's happening to the Arctic sea ice. How fast is it thinning? Because the direct relationship between the thinning of the Arctic sea ice and extreme weather events that cause enormous economic damage in China is a scientific relationship. Not 20 years in the future, but within few months. And in the last few weeks, this January and February, the Western media did not carry these stories of the profound severe weather events, the coldest winter in living memory in China, bigger economic damage to many regions in China than were caused by Storm Sandy on the eastern coast of the United States. China Daily, China's cold winter linked to Arctic sea ice loss. Do we need the Chinese to tell us why we are here? Do we need to look at the almost 200,000 frozen cattle out in the field because of what's happening in our Arctic neighborhood? I have to hand it to the conservative daily in Britain, the Telegraph, that it was among the few Western media that tried to wake us up to this story. So, it was not new. The reason why the Snow Dragon was here last summer on this historic scientific journey was that in the winter of 2007 to 2008, China had experienced colossal economic destructions, the breakdown in power lines and railways, economic damages of a scale they had not seen for decades. And they related it to the loss of the Arctic sea ice in 2007. So last year they came to find out what was happening. And within few months, the proof was again there. In the United States, one of many remarkable American scientists, we just listened to a global leader from the US, Cornell and MIT, here this afternoon. But Jennifer Francis has tried to point out and to the political leadership of the United States that there is also a direct relationship between the melting of the Arctic sea ice and the extreme weather events in the US. Storm Sandy and the cold winter in China this January are part of the same pattern. The destruction of homes to hundreds and thousands of Americans, and the political bondage between the Republican and the American candidate, President Obama and Governor Christie, was caused by the Arctic sea ice. That's why they came together a few days before the election. These unlikely partners at the heat of the American campaign, because the destruction in their neighborhood, in the entire western coast of America, surpassed every and any political division. So I decided to remind us here this morning and afternoon why we are here. Because our ice-dependent world is melting, and melting fast. Of course, in Iceland, we don't have to go to international conferences to remind us that the glaciers are melting. As our beloved foreign minister said the opening of this conference, he has a pillow talk every night with his outstanding glaciologist that also happens to be his wife, reminding him of how the glaciers are melting. It's not every foreign minister in the world who has been so lucky in his marriage. If that was so, we probably would have a greater progress on the climate change negotiations. Antarctica, the Arctic, the Himalayas. These pictures were taken by Rax, an outstanding Icelandic photographer, last year of the emerging lakes on the Greenland ice sheet. The fast melting of the extraordinary ice sheet in Greenland are creating water phenomena that nobody has ever seen before. And let us remember here today the size of Greenland, half the size of Europe. You have to add together France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and a few other European countries to get to the size of Greenland. And it is gradually being turned into a fast-melting, water-dominated world, the Himalayas. The region which the Chinese so cleverly, the Tibetan Polar Research Institute, has decided to call the third pole, in order to get away from the political connotations, but also to remind us that we have the North Pole and the South Pole, but then we have the third pole in the Himalayan, with thousands of glaciers. But they have hardly been studied. Many of the predominant Himalayan countries are at the same stage of knowledge about their glaciers as we were in Iceland 50 years ago. And in a few weeks' time, in the first time in history, Indian and Chinese and other Himalayan glaciologists will come together in India to discuss what's happening in their neighborhood. The people of Bangladesh live in fear. They don't know whether most of their country will still exist when the children of today will become old. These pictures could become the everyday future of a region which houses and homes about 2 million people, about a third or a quarter of the global population. So, climate change, we all know, is a topic that is supposed to be on the agenda. Although it has taken the American president 4 years to even mention it. But he did in his second inaugural speech. But at the OECD, the economic organization which was created after the Second World War to combine the future economic vision of the global leaders like the United States, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, and the others, they are looking for a new vision. The Secretary General has stated in a very important document issued by the OECD in recent months that there is an extraordinary need to look for new models, to ask ourselves critical questions, to be able to find new ways. So they invited me last week to give a speech about the Icelandic experience, not the financial crisis, not the collapse of the banks, but a speech about a clean energy economy. And I've emphasized the world economy because I think it is of fundamental importance to get our message across that this is not about drilling. This is not about engineering. This is not about how we can go as deep down as possible. This is about how we will transform our economy. So the pictures I showed before will stop being the alarming message of this century and the next one. Because otherwise, our ice-dependent world will keep on melting and turn every economy upside down. So gradually I have come to the conclusion that Iceland's most important message from our geothermal experience is not the power plants, although they are splendid and inspiring. It's not the district heating system, although it is extraordinary. It is the demonstration of what a clean energy economy is all about. That it is, in fact, good business with multidimensional dynamic opportunities for all people, everywhere, to follow this road. Of course, it began by building power projects, like the one in the Reykjanes Peninsula, where the power station, of course, produces electricity and district heating, but also has become the center of what Albert, the technological leader among many in that extraordinary project, had called a geothermal park. And within a radius of 3 kilometers, we have fantastic demonstrations on what a clean energy economy is all about. We also have other power plants in other parts of the country that have enabled us to do the same thing, interlinked, of course, the international grid, as we all know. But that is not the core of my message. The core of my message, not only here today, but throughout my presidency, has to be to try to explain to people in other parts of the world how they can take this Icelandic experience and transform their economies and their future. Jiang Zemin, President of China more than 10 years ago. We were fortunate to bring him to the Nesjavellir geothermal power plant. He brought a number of ministers from the Chinese cabinet with him. It was the first time in history that the Chinese leadership came to a geothermal power plant. They were all engineers. They stayed much longer than the protocol had planned. It derailed the lunch with the Prime Minister, got me into a lot of trouble. But it was the beginning of the Chinese system starting to examine, can we do it? And throughout the following 10 years, we have gradually come to what is now a cooperation between Icelandic participation and Sinopec, the biggest energy company in China, to do there exactly what we have done here in Iceland. Replace coal-powered heating in cities with urban district geothermal heating system by going, as we did, street by street, district by district, house by house, until the entire city had been made a clean city. Wen Xiaobao, more than 10 years later, visited the newest plant, hosted by our foreign minister and his knowledgeable wife at the Hellisheiði power plant. Why did the Prime Minister of China stay in this small country in the North Atlantic for 3 days with a big part of his cabinet, the foreign minister, the minister of commerce, the minister of resources, and many others? Not because they were fascinated by the engineering achievement, but because they realize that if China does not change into a clean energy economy, the glaciers in the Himalayas will cause, together with the melting of the Arctic sea ice, such economic destruction to China throughout this century that whatever they do will not be able to surpass it. China and India. Sonia Gandhi, one of the most powerful women in the world, definitely for the last 10 years, the second most powerful person in India, came to Iceland 13 years ago when she was in opposition. We took her to a geothermal site with her delegation. You can see I look much younger in this picture than I do now. And it was explained to her and Manmohan Singh, who 2 years later would become the Prime Minister of India, what this was all about. And this is one of my favorite pictures. Sonia Gandhi with her Indian fellow countrymen at this geothermal site in Iceland. Since then, we have gradually been cooperating with her country as well. The United Nations geothermal program has, of course, become, as was mentioned here before, when Ingvar was so splendidly being honored for his work, become not only an important instrument in helping to distribute knowledge and capabilities, but also has become a pillar of the Icelandic foreign policy, the basis on which we now have constructive relationships with dozens of countries that we wouldn't really have anything to talk about if it was not for this transformation. So not only has the geothermal transformation enabled us to change Reykjavik from a coal city into a clean city, not only has it enabled us to build electricity from geothermal resources. And not only has it enabled us to build diplomatic and political relationship with the emerging powers of the 21st century, India and China, and as my good friend Professor Tester knows, we have tried hard with the United States. Maybe we will succeed more in the coming years. But it has also enabled Iceland to develop what I call a clean energy economy. And in my opinion, with all due respect to the other economic measures and the fiscal policies and the financial mechanisms that have been instigated after the collapse of the banks more than 4 years ago, one of the major reasons why Iceland has recovered earlier and more effectively than anybody could have expected was the clean energy economic transformation, which was executed in the previous years and decades. The Rio Tinto aluminum smelter, built first by a Swiss company, then sold to the Canadians, who was then taken over by Rio Tinto. Not very many people know that when the Lehman Brothers collapsed, Rio Tinto stopped all investments everywhere in the world for a considerable period. And the first investment decision that Rio Tinto, one of the primary global companies in the world, took after the fall of Lehman Brothers was to modernize their aluminum smelter in Iceland with an investment of $500 million, the biggest investment that has taken place in this country after the fall of the banks. Iceland, which at that time was exhibit number one of a failed state in many of the global media, was the place where Rio Tinto decided to invest. Why? Not because of our banking system. That had failed. Not because of me or the foreign minister or the political leaders, no. Because of long-term access to clean energy. Because Iceland would continue to be a place where an aluminum company that wants to be competitive in the 22nd century will be able to prove that their aluminum creates less carbon footprint than the aluminum produced by their competitors. So an electric car arriving on the streets, built by aluminum from Iceland, will be more environmentally friendly than an electric car built by aluminum from a number of other countries I'm not going to mention here this afternoon. Similarly, the Alcoa plant in eastern Iceland. Many of you from other countries perhaps don't know that Alcoa wanted to build a second smelter in the northeastern Iceland. And we talked about it for a few years. And even after the collapse of the banks, they wanted to build a second smelter in the northeastern Iceland and use exclusively geothermal electricity to drive that smelter. But it was us who hesitated in that decision for a number of reasons I'm not going to go into here. But that doesn't change the fact that not only did Rio Tinto directly invest in Iceland because of the clean energy economy, but Alcoa also wanted to double their presence in Iceland for the same reason. The young data storage centers that have started to be built in our country, partly because of the cable linkage to other countries, but also because the marketing position of data storage companies run on clean energy is stronger for the environmentally concerned, educated younger generations that use the information modern economy to their benefit. They want to be sure that the data they use every day in their homes and in their workplace has not destroyed the environment through the data storage. And then, of course, the greenhouses. I'm going to make a confession here. It's not often that people in my position make confessions sort of publicly. It is somehow the guiding moral of a successful presidency that you maintain you're always right. But I made the mistake for a number of years, as you could see from these previous pictures, that when I wanted to impress the president of China, the leaders of India, and many others with geothermal, I took them to a power plant. I showed them the extraordinary engineering and the drilling achievement, the work done by many of the distinguished Icelanders here today. I didn't take them to a greenhouse. And I definitely didn't take them to a fish drying factory. But a few years ago, especially during the visit of my good friend Farooq Abdullah, the Minister for Renewable Energy of India, the former governor of Kashmir, I realized that the greenhouses probably carry a stronger message to people from Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world than a technological power plant. And it was when he saw these greenhouses in Hveragerði that it suddenly dawned on him that geothermal transformation of Kashmir, enabling the Indian military to grow vegetables in greenhouses up in the cold areas of Kashmir, could be a fascinating contribution to the military security of India in that part of the world. Especially since most of them are vegetarians anyhow. So the greenhouses have enabled us here in Iceland to replace the import of vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, and others with the local farming greenhouse sector. When Kofi Annan came here last year and gave the commemorative speech at the 100th anniversary of the University of Iceland, I had often talked to him about geothermal while he was Secretary General. So I decided to give him and organize a half-a-day geothermal seminar for him, and we did it up in the Hellisheiði power plant. But what struck him most was when the sales representative of the farmers' tomato and cucumber selling organization described how the Icelandic farmers had created a cooperative association using their local farming greenhouses all over the country to strengthen the marketing position. He suddenly saw the relevance for the local economy all over Africa, for the possibility of farmers in different African countries, for the fascinating new life that the poorest of the poor in Africa could have through a localized greenhouse transformation in those parts of East Africa that are rich with low and medium temperature geothermal areas. Of course, as you know, those of you who are staying in this country as guests, that in the restaurants you not only have the excellence of the fish and the meat, you also have the extraordinary tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers produced in the Icelandic greenhouses. We are also proud to have the largest banana plantation in Europe. It's not huge, but it's considerable. But it's, of course, under glass. And because of the Icelandic water, the tomatoes grown in the greenhouses with no pesticides are better and have a stronger marketing position, and that is why it's now being discussed to build a huge greenhouse solely for the purpose of growing tomatoes for export. Iceland, a tomato exporting country. This is my favorite. This is my favorite to remind myself of my mistakes and my lack of understanding and my lack of comprehension. Because although I had been speaking about geothermal for over a decade, taking a long list of prominent global leaders to the power plants, I had never, ever taken anybody to this fish drying facility, which is 2 kilometers from the Svartsengi power plant that I showed in the beginning. Drying fish heads, cod heads, the backbones, the things that we threw away 30 years ago. Because the tradition of the Icelandic fishing industry was to take the fillets of the fish and throw everything else back into the sea because we couldn't sell it anywhere. Of course, we dried whole cod out in the air. It took more than 6 months. A lot of us in our younger days got the money in the summer school holiday to do that work. But in the 70s, 2 Icelandic fishermen were on a boat on their way back home when they said to each other, why don't we try to use this geothermal heat to dry the things that we are throwing away? And these 2 fishermen created this multi-million-dollar business by making us realize that by using geothermal heat, low temperature, it takes us 5 days to dry this. And the beauty of it is that the sacks that are imported from India, the oldest way that the Indians have used to store things that they transport from one place to another, when they have been filled with this dry Icelandic cod heads and backbones and things that we threw away before, they can be transported as they are to the Nigerian local market, where they can be stored without any facilities, just like this, out in the slums for 2 years. For 2 years. 20% of the food produced in India gets destroyed within a week because there are no facilities to store it. The same story in Asia, Africa, Latin America. The food crisis, the global food crisis, is not caused by the lack of food, not caused by not producing enough food. The global food crisis is caused by the lack of storage of the food that we already produce. So these 2 Icelandic fishermen, in my opinion, were one of the major geothermal innovators in my country. Because if we take this global and we use it not just for fish, we use it for meat, we use it for fruit, we use it for vegetables. We could make within the next 5 or 10 years the single most important contribution to the global food crisis and the economic transformation of villages and towns on every continent. There's a region in Pakistan which is the largest producers of apricots in the world. But 1/3 of the annual harvest gets destroyed every year because they can't store it. And excuse the expression, there's no chance in hell that we are going to build freezing infrastructure like we have here in Iceland and America and Germany and elsewhere in our supermarkets to store food. And if we did and succeeded, we would probably destroy the environment completely along the way. So the only method to bring us globally out of the emerging food crisis is to take the geothermal example of drying food from Iceland, combine it with solar and wind tech, localized technologies in different countries, and do it everywhere. A clean energy economy. Of course, the Blue Lagoon is a story everybody knows. Many of you probably know Richard Quest. He is he's one of the best-known business TV personalities in the world. Quest means business, CNN globally, every day. I invited him to Iceland last November. I took him to the Blue Lagoon. He was absolutely flabbergasted when he realized it was not a natural phenomenon. Some of you might know that 2 months ago, the National Geographic put the Blue Lagoon on the list of the 20 most remarkable places on planet Earth. The problem is the other 19 are all created by God Almighty. But the Blue Lagoon was created by Grímsson and a few Icelanders. It is not only our best-known tourist site, it is one of the globally best-known tourist sites, a gigantic moneymaker based on the leftover water from a geothermal power plant. How many tourists do you think would agree to bath in the spill of water from a power plant? But it is a dramatic example of what I call a clean energy economy. How to gather the availability of a clean energy together with the innovation and the inspiration and the entrepreneurship can create out of nothing in 10 years one of the most successful tourist sites in the world. The Icelandic swimming pools, created in every locality in Iceland, not for the tourists, but for ourselves. So we can teach our children to swim and we can come together and gossip and say some bad things about the president and the foreign minister and everybody else. But they have surprisingly turned out to be an important tourist site, where a big part of the tourists who come to Iceland make on their own these swimming pool tours that none of us in Iceland had the innovative business sense to actually create. But we now find them everywhere because for them it is a remarkable experience. The swimming pool-based clean energy economy. I'm throwing at you these paradoxical realities, not visions or hypotheses, but realities that are now up and running successful business enterprises. And then this, the greenhouse close to the Reykjanes power plant. Some years ago, innovative Icelandic scientists spent a lot of time creating protein from plants in order to sell it in hospitals and medical research institutions, because to use animal protein has many religious and cultural difficulties in big parts of the world, but also there is a limit to the availability of animal protein. And they succeeded in building genetically tailored protein from barley. And they built this greenhouse close to the geothermal power plant to grow the barley. But they found out recently that as a byproduct of this is this cosmetic in this tiny bottle, EGF. And if you really want to impress your loved ones, you should buy one. I am not representing the company, but the effect it has on your skin is extraordinary. My wife gave a bottle of it to Martha Stewart last year. And after Martha had used it for a week, she decided to do a whole program on Iceland. Now, this small bottle and jar, based on the geothermal economy in Iceland, is sold on Air France, British Airways, Lufthansa, a number of other international airlines. How many of you from the geothermal sector could have the imagination to predict that based on geothermal utilization, you could sell cosmetics on Air France? That's the reality. Yet another dimension of what I call the clean energy economy. And then, of course, we should not forget the universities. The extraordinary contribution that this sector has made to our universities, to our engineering departments, our medical departments, our geological departments, and almost every part, the IT sectors of our universities. We would not have the potential of the Icelandic universities and research community if it hadn't been for the geothermal and the hydro basis of our clean energy economy. And out of the work that is being done in our universities are coming all kinds of innovations and new companies and patents, indicating also the extraordinary connection between the energy transformation and the creation of a multidimensional, dynamic, clean energy economy. So, my dear friends, really my message here today is that if we want to change the world, which we must, unfortunately, and I have to tell you, for me, this journey has almost become a moral obligation. Because in the light of what's happening to our ice-covered world and to our climate, we must get the message across. But unfortunately, as my good friend and distinguished Professor Tester just showed, it is difficult to get even technologically advanced countries like the United States to realize, despite the MIT report, the great potential they have. And that is why I have somehow come to these crossroads, answering the question I put in the beginning, where do we go from here? That it is of great importance that in addition to talking about all the subjects that you have dwelt on during this conference, we must start talking about a clean energy economy and make the case for the economic transformation that a clean energy economy can enable countries to execute quickly and effectively with unlimited possibilities, as these examples I've just shown you, some of them completely paradoxical to our traditional image of an energy conference or even a geothermal conference. Who should speak about cosmetics at a geothermal conference? Many of you probably don't know that the Blue Lagoon will soon sell cosmetics annually for about 1 billion Icelandic kroners. And then, of course, is the fish farming. I hesitate to talk about that in front of my good friend, the foreign minister, because as many of you know, he has a PhD in the diseases of salmons and fish farming. But, of course, that is yet another dimension. And to me, an additional wake-up transformation is this fish, Senegal sole. Senegal sole. As the name indicates, a warm ocean fish, more at home in the Mediterranean and off the coast of Africa than in the cold Icelandic North Atlantic Ocean. But if you have the time, on your way to the airport, you could stop by the construction site where one of the leading fish farming companies in the world, a Norwegian company, is now building a Senegal sole fish farm with the aim of within 2 or 3 years to produce annually 2,000 tons of Senegal sole and then go from there. Iceland started to export fish, Mediterranean, African fish, due to the geothermal transformation. Cosmetics, tomatoes, Senegal sole. I could also have put carbon recycling here on the screen. How this new company close to the power plant is producing clean energy from carbon due to the proximity to the geothermal power site. As we all know, when we talk about this possibility to people in different countries, many say, yes, of course, you in Iceland, you are blessed with all these volcanoes and all these earthquakes, but unfortunately, we don't really have the possibility to do so in our part of the world. And in the US, that is the reply one gets. And somehow we have all, including me, made this mistake of showing maps like this, where the geological splits in the world to sort of dominate the global vision, instead of showing pictures like this, drilling rigs, to remind us that inside the earth is this extraordinary big fireball, and we only live and exist on a very thin layer on the top. And this fireball is not just under Iceland. It's under every country, every ocean in the world. And as Professor Tester showed so brilliantly with the maps of the United States, and I'm sure he is absolutely right when he says it's no longer a question of technology, because we can already drill down to 5, 6, 7 kilometers and harness the heat which is there below. So, it can't be done everywhere. It can also be done in different ways, whether you want to use high temperature, medium or low temperature areas. If your vision is the clean energy economy, if you're focused not just on electricity production, but all the extraordinary economic, dynamic, entrepreneurial opportunities that come with this transformation that make your communities rich, help African and Asian farmers to dry their food and their fishermen, help brilliant scientists to create new products that are sold on international airlines, and makes Iceland the most successful European tourist site in the last 3 years. This picture was shown at the beginning of the conference, and I borrowed it from Bjarni to remind us also at the end of this extraordinary conference that only 0.1% of the stored heat would satisfy the global energy consumption for 10,000 years. It is, my friends, a crazy statistics that we have inside the earth with the available technology, the possibility to harness this heat for our benefit, but fundamentally to create globally a clean energy economy, like we have here in Iceland succeeded in doing so. Otherwise, the transformation of this part of the world will continue to threaten our future. And that's serious. That's not just speculation. When you go to a hospital, we tend to trust the doctors due to their science and their knowledge. Every scientific institute that does study on the glacial ice-covered areas of the world carries the same message. That was why the snow dragon arrived in Iceland last summer from Shanghai, the first time in human history, because they knew that if the Arctic sea ice continued to melt, there would be disastrous consequences in China, not 20 years from now, but next winter. So, the clean energy economy. That is the good side of this story, that we can prevent climate change and become rich at the same time. We can prevent the ice from melting and create one of the most successful economies in the world despite the financial crisis due to the clean energy transformation. Whether it is aluminum smelters, power plants, data storage centers, production of cosmetics, fooling the Senegal soul, or having these extraordinary women picking tomatoes in Iceland, selling dried codfish that was dried 2 years before in the slums of Nairobi, 2 years later, or being a young, aspiring scientist. If we want to create a future for these women and others, the message is clear. The clean energy economy is their best road to a sustainable, secure, and inspiring world. Thank you.